The radar screen was already crowded before anyone realized the formation was wrong. 3 American destroyers drifting through black water in the Persian Gulf. Tight spacing, defensive posture, calm sea state. Then 50 fast boats appeared almost at once. Not gradually. They just arrived. Tiny heat signatures ripping across the water at nearly 50 knots. Engines screaming so hard the infrared cameras looked smeared. Some carried rockets. Some looked empty. A few didn't even show transponder signals. And that was the first problem. Nobody knew which boats were real threats. Inside the Combat Information Center aboard the USS Mason, one radar operator actually thought the system had glitched, because swarms don't usually move like that. These boats weren't charging in a straight line. They were weaving, breaking apart, crossing wakes intentionally. Some accelerated directly toward the destroyers, while others peeled away toward the dark horizon, like they were trying to overload human attention itself. One officer muttered, "They're mapping our reactions." Nobody answered him. At that point, the American ships still had total firepower dominance. It wasn't even close. 3 destroyers, guided missiles, electronic warfare suites, helicopters, close-in weapon systems that can literally shred incoming missiles out of the sky. Against speedboats, on paper, this should have lasted about 30 seconds. But the boats kept coming. Closer, closer, and weirdly, the destroyers still weren't maneuvering aggressively. That confused everyone watching the feeds later. Why hold formation? Why wait? The answer was sitting underwater. But nobody on the bridge knew that yet. A warning crackled through the radio. Unidentified vessels closing inside exclusion range. No response. Another warning. Still nothing. Then one of the Iranian boats fired green flares directly across the bow of the lead destroyer. Not at it. Across it, like a challenge. And suddenly the atmosphere inside the American ships changed from professional to personal. You could hear in the voices. The calm briefing room tone disappeared. Now people were talking faster, shorter sentences, repeating bearings. One sailor later described the CIC as 30 people trying not to sound nervous at the same time. Meanwhile, the Iranian boats kept splitting apart into smaller clusters. That mattered, because defensive systems hate uncertainty. A missile is easy. It flies predictably. 50 tiny contacts moving independently in darkness? That's chaos. And chaos burns time. One destroyer launched a helicopter. That should have stabilized the situation. Instead, it made everything worse. The helicopter pilot immediately reported something strange near the southern edge of the formation. No heat signatures. No navigation lights. But visible wake patterns. Something large was moving out there. The crew initially assumed civilian traffic. Then sonar reported metallic transient noise below the layer. Very faint. Too faint. That's when the first uncomfortable thought hit the command crew. What if the boats weren't the attack? The bridge went quiet for almost 3 seconds, which, inside a combat information center, feels incredibly long. Because now the swarm stopped looking aggressive. It started looking distracting. Another fast boat suddenly accelerated directly toward the USS Nitsa. 30 knots. 40. 45. The American crew locked weapons. Everyone expected warning shots. Nothing happened. The destroyer still held fire. And honestly, that decision irritated some of the sailors. You could hear frustration bleeding into radio traffic. Because the rules of engagement were becoming a psychological weapon. The Iranian boats knew exactly how close they could get before triggering lethal response thresholds. So they kept dancing on the edge. One officer compared it to being swarmed by hornets carrying gasoline. Then the radar lost 4 boats simultaneously. Not destroyed. Gone. Just vanished. That was the second bad sign. Operators checked for sea clutter. Jamming. Thermal interference. Nothing fit. And then one of the missing boats suddenly reappeared behind the American formation. Behind it, nobody understood how. For about 20 seconds, confusion completely replaced doctrine. And confusion at sea spreads fast. Because every delayed decision creates 3 more decisions. The helicopters started widening their search pattern. That's when they found the wakes again. Long, heavy, subsurface disturbance. Moving slowly beneath the fast boat chaos. Not civilian. Too controlled. The helicopter crew lowered sonar. Static. Lowered again. Then came the call nobody wanted to hear. Possible submarine contact. Everything changed instantly because small boats are annoying. Submarines kill warships. The destroyers finally broke formation. Too late to look confident. Too early to look panicked. An Iranian swarm reacted immediately. That was the disturbing part. The boats didn't scatter randomly. They adjusted with the destroyers, like they already expected the maneuver, which raised a brutal question inside the American command structure. Had the entire swarm been built around predicting destroyer behavior? At this point, the situation started getting embarrassing. A billion-dollar naval screen was being tactically manipulated by fiberglass speedboats with outboard motors. One sailor later joked, "We brought Aegis radar to a knife fight in a parking lot." Dark humor. Classic survival mechanism. Meanwhile, the suspected submarine contact vanished. Sonar lost it completely. No screws. No cavitation. Nothing. Just empty water. And suddenly everyone became much more aware of the silence between radio calls. That silence mattered, because silence at sea usually means somebody's listening. The Iranian boats surge again, this time from 3 directions. One cluster approached so aggressively that the USS Gridley activated its close-in defensive tracking radar. Not firing, just tracking. The rotating system locked onto multiple boats simultaneously. And that's when several Iranian vessels abruptly slowed down, not because they were afraid, because they'd achieved something. They got the Americans to reveal radar behavior. That was the pivot. The boats were never trying to sink the destroyers. They were collecting reactions, timing, sensor rotations, response windows, electronic signatures. The swarm itself was reconnaissance. And somewhere beyond visual range, someone else was recording everything. Now, the earlier submarine contact made more sense. Maybe it wasn't hunting. Maybe it was listening. The realization spread to the fleet almost physically. You could feel confidence draining out of conversations. Because once you understand you're being studied, every movement suddenly feels exposed. Then another problem appeared. Fuel. The helicopters had been airborne too long. One pilot requested recovery windows. Command delayed it. Again, nobody wanted fewer eyes in the air. But exhausted crews make mistakes. And tired pilots start missing details. That mattered more than anyone realized. Because one helicopter crew finally spotted the thing causing the disappearing radar contacts. Floating reflector arrays. Tiny decoy. Devices bobbing in the water. Cheap. Portable. Effective. The swarm had been deploying false radar signatures the entire time, which meant the American ships had spent nearly 40 minutes partially reacting to ghosts. That discovery should have calmed everyone down. Instead, it triggered a different fear. If the decoys were this sophisticated, what else had they prepared? Then the sea lit up, briefly. Orange flashed near the horizon. Not an explosion. Engine backfire. One Iranian boat had overloaded itself, pushing maximum throttle. The irony actually broke tension on one bridge for a moment. A sailor laughed. Another didn't, because seconds later, thermal cameras caught something else hidden behind a disabled boat. Larger craft. Low profile. Fast. And now the Americans face another ugly possibility. The damaged boat may have been deliberate bait. The destroyers adjusted heading again, but the swarm was now inside complicated engagement distance. Too close for comfort. Too scattered for missiles. Too politically dangerous for random gunfire. That's the nightmare nobody outside naval warfare really understands. Modern warships are terrifying against declared threats. Ambiguous threats are much harder, especially when cameras are rolling, and there were cameras everywhere. Several Iranian boats were visibly filming the destroyers from shockingly close range. Psychological warfare, mixed with reconnaissance. One commander later admitted the hardest part wasn't tactical uncertainty. It was knowing the entire encounter was being designed for information extraction and propaganda simultaneously. Then communications briefly failed, only for 17 seconds. But 17 seconds in a swarm engagement feels enormous. The radio net dissolved into clipped partial transmissions. Bearing calls overlapped. One helicopter missed instructions completely. And during that tiny communication gap, 3 Iranian boats penetrated deeper between the destroyers, not attacking, just existing where they shouldn't have been able to exist. That was humiliating. The American ships corrected immediately. But the psychological damage was done. The swarm had proven it could fracture spacing. And now every commander aboard those destroyers knew something uncomfortable. If missiles appeared right now, the defensive geometry was compromised. Then sonar picked up the underwater contact again. Closer, much closer. The report came in shaky. Even the sonar operator sounded confused, because the contact wasn't behaving like a normal submarine anymore. Its speed profile kept changing abruptly. Slow, fast, slow again, almost experimental. And then the contact vanished directly beneath commercial tanker traffic, using civilian noise as cover. That's when the situation stopped feeling like harassment. This was systems testing. American reactions, response timing, sensor overlap, command latency, formation adjustment, helicopter endurance. Every piece was being measured, and the Iranian swarm suddenly started pulling away, not retreating, disengaging, cleanly, like a drill ending on schedule, which honestly rattled some crews more than aggression would have, because it implied control. The boats peeled off into darkness, one group at a time, engines fading into open water. No dramatic finale. No missiles. No battle. Just silence returning to the Gulf. But the destroyers didn't relax. Not even close. Because the submarine contact was still unresolved. And somewhere out there, somebody now possessed a detailed behavioral map of 3 American warships under live swarm pressure. One intelligence officer later described the encounter with a sentence that spread quietly through naval circles afterward. They never tried to beat the destroyers. Pause. They tried to understand them. And honestly, that may have been worse.